Hello and welcome to the Federal. I am Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay, your host of the program Off the Beaten Track. In this program, we go to the depth of one single issue. Today, we will be talking about elections. In just about a few months, we will be in the middle of a parliamentary elections of 2024. Few months before that, towards the end of this year, November, December, we will be having assembly elections in 5 important states, of which 3 are virtually going to be Congress versus BJP contest. In this situation, where there is a lot of churn in the last few months, we are going to be straight away getting into the election season, trying to make sense of what is happening. My guest today, I am going to be speaking to a professor of political anthropology at the London School of Economics and Political Science, Mukulika Banerjee, who works on the intersection of political anthropology, politics, and history. All 3 very important issues, which are there in India. History constantly keeps on coming back into India's present moment. Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister of India, keeps on talking about 1,000 years of period of slavery and 1,000 years golden period ahead of India. So, Mukulika Banerjee, first of all, welcome to this program and thank you very much for having spared your time all the way from London, on a weekday, sparing time and speaking with us.
Thank you.
You have, during the pandemic, done a book, Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India, and your very important work came out almost 10 years ago in 2014, which was Why India Votes. So you are actually the right person to understand, that why do people vote? What are the motivations which really go into people's mind when they make up their mind as to in whose favor do they press the button on the electronic voting machine in India. In barely 7 months from now, by next March, we will be in the middle of an election season. We expect any time in the first week of March, the elections to be called, that's scheduled to be announced by the Election Commission of India. Prior to that, as I said in the introduction, November, December, we have elections in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, Telangana, and Mizoram. Now, everybody keeps on saying that 2024 is going to be the most crucial election that India has faced in recent history. I want to understand from you that how is the impending election of 2024 different from what we saw in 2014 and 2019?
Okay, so this could be a very long answer, but let me pick out 4 or 5 reasons, I think, why it could be different and why it is different. We should just take a step back and recognize a fact that is not stated often enough, that democracy is not just elections, like you were saying. Democracy really is a combination of the institutional structure of democracy, which is elections, separation of powers, elected representatives, and so on.
Right.
And then there is the democratic culture of our country. What is the culture of democracy? So institutions plus culture is what makes a democracy recognizably one. So if we had to look at these 2 things and compare them from in the last 10 years, what has happened to both of them? If you look at democratic culture, by which we mean citizens have rights, they have a voice, the state ensures security, that the sovereignty of the nation is maintained, but also that dissent is allowed, that people are free to say something, they are to ask questions, or to hold elected governments to account. Accountability is such an important part of democratic culture. And this is exactly what happens in between elections, right? Once you've elected your governments, you should be able to ask questions. The free media is such an important part of that asking of questions.
Consensus building also, can I add to that?
Yes, and you have to take, I mean, there has to be some common purpose, right? That everybody agrees to an agenda, a consensus, if you wish. On those indicators, the country, several indicators show this, that in the last 10 years, on all these democratic culture indicators, things have transformed beyond recognition and are deeply worrying. So they've transformed not for the better, unfortunately. So for instance, I'm an academic. If you look at the issue of academic freedom, there are controversies all the time, but the fact that
we are just speaking a few days after the controversy at the Ashoka University,
that's
one
right,
of the private universities from which much was expected in terms of academic freedom.
That's right, where the vice chancellor had to resign a couple of years ago. Now a young assistant professor is put to scrutiny by arbitrary committees because of the research findings of a working paper. So there's a touchiness about any questions asked. And of course, then we have cases like Umar Khalid and others who are incarcerated simply for being Muslim, right? And on no grounds at all, or constantly journalists, academics, civil society actors, the Muslim members of which are, of course, the first ones to be jailed. So when we think about democratic culture, the second thing is the performance of the government, which, if this is meant to be a government of the people and for the people, then what is it doing for the people? So if we look at the record unemployment numbers, for instance, the complete fracturing of social cohesion. So the polarization that we talk about a lot, the polarization in India is on several axes. So there is the religious polarization, which of course is, at the heart of the Hindutva project, is precisely to polarize, again, along religious lines. But then there is the polarization of the very rich and the very poor. So the sale of super luxury cars have gone up multiple times, whereas two-wheelers are falling. So the gap, the social inequality is increasing. So that's another polarization. There's a polarization, I suspect, between men and women, and we can talk about this a little bit later in more detail, as we should. So there is, and then there is a sort of constant assault on fairly public figures. We remember Shah Rukh Khan. It was like, who's the most famous Muslim in the world? Let's harass him. You take the farmers who are asking perfectly, they're exercising their right to protest, and you call them terrorists. The Olympian wrestlers saying they, protesting against the sexual harassment they have to face, and you turn police batons on them. So the fracturing of, this doesn't feel very much like democratic culture at the moment. So that has, and that is, I know there's a lot of pushback from people who ask the classic what about questions, and India hasn't been always a, calm, peaceful polity. But there is an unprecedented fracturing at the moment. It's almost as if the country is on fire. And another polarization, which, thinking about your question, I'm thinking, if you look at our border states, our frontiers of the Indian nation as it stands, whether it is Manipur, whether it is Arunachal, Kashmir, Punjab, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, these are either it's on fire, like we've seen with Manipur for 6 months now, or there is this increasing polarization between North and South, where Southern states are repeatedly pointing out their extraordinary economic growth, human development indicators, versus states like Uttar Pradesh, whose human development indicators are worse than Nepal's. So there is, it's a very difficult, diverse.
If I may add at this moment, Southern states are increasingly, when we speak to political leaders from Southern states, they're increasingly fearing their marginalization, political marginalization, with the impending, delimitation which is going to
That's
the
right.
old formula is stuck by, then they are going to have proportionally much fewer seats in parliament than what they have at the moment. So this is quite a frightening situation for them, that their voice, in any case, they are numerically not so strong as the northern and the western states, which is the heartland of the I call as the Hindutva belt.
Right.
This is where actually the real notion of Bharat, as far as the Sangh Parivar is concerned, that is where it is restricted to. So there is this worry also in southern India. Yes, please. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's absolutely really important to point out. And if I may add, and that allows us to segue into the institutional question, what has happened to democratic institutions in the last 10 years? Then this issue of North and South is really an issue of fiscal federalism as well, where the GST, the way it has been introduced, has meant that southern states simply, though they generate a lot of revenue in taxation, simply don't, because it is centralized, the collection of this tax, which is part of the design of this tax. But then it also means that you can make it extremely political, and disbursement through GST Council, through particular state governments, is a flawed and political process, which basically means you punish your political rivals. So again, there is almost being punitive measures institutionally enabled against states that perform better on several indicators. On the democratic institutions question, I mean, you are a journalist, Nilanjan. I don't need to tell you what has happened with the media in India, and this has been written about and talked about so much. But still, it is really worth making the point. I live in the UK, and it is every time I hear the Prime Minister, the Cabinet being roasted on morning talk shows on BBC Radio 4 or on television, on Channel 4 News, you remember Britain is a very flawed point. It has its own problems, of course. This is no perfect democracy at all, please. But there is an ability to turn around and ask those in power difficult questions, which they have to face. And they have to face those questions in Parliament, right? So every Wednesday, there is question time, which the Prime Minister of Britain has to take from the leader of the opposition. If the Prime Minister is missing from Prime Minister's question time, he has to depute somebody to stand in for him. So there are processes of democracy which have to be recognizable in order for India to be counted as one. And then finally, I mean, there's so much one can say about institutions, but I think we really need to talk about the Election Commission and what has happened. Right. And I particularly want to do this because, of course, we've been, you mentioned Why India Votes. Why India Votes was published in 2014 on the back of research done during the 2009 Lok Sabha elections. So in the first 10 years of watching elections extremely closely, as I did in India, as I continue to do. But at that time, there was a celebration of the Election Commission of India, of the conduct of elections. There was, and quite rightful celebration, I think.
Yes.
That remarkable reputation, really, for a country like India, what it pulled off, and was held as a beacon when Britain wanted to set up its own electoral commission in 2001. Indian officials were advising them. They sought their advice.
Right.
That institutional probity, I'm afraid, has completely disappeared to a large measure. I'm not saying it has completely gone, but things are extremely worrying in coming up to the 2024 elections. And we can talk about this if you wish.
Yes, just to add at this point, you're talking about the Election Commission. We have a pending bill, which was very suddenly introduced by the government towards the end of the recently concluded monsoon session of Parliament, for which nobody was prepared. None of the opposition parties were actually intimated about it previously, that the government intended to bring a bill. And this bill has been brought in, which primarily reverses what the Supreme Court laid out in a very significant judgment previously. So for every important judgment which the Supreme Court or any other strong, of the judiciary has been coming out with, there has always been an executive action, We have seen this. We have seen this, with the Delhi Services Bill. It's about the power of an elected government of Delhi and the central control over the state of Delhi, which is actually halfway between a union territory and a full-fledged state. So what I understand, if I actually try to summarize what you're saying, is that 2024 is actually very significant compared to 2014 and 2019 because of a steep decline in a lot of democratic values which has happened in the last decade. So if we cannot have an intervention which actually reverses this decline, then it is going to be a further fall, and we really do not know that whether we will continue to remain a democracy only in name and not in spirit at all. Would there be further decline? This is what you are saying.
Yes.
Now, we also are aware of the fact that towards the early months of this year, if you had asked anybody, people like me, I'll talk about myself because that's the best way of saying, that how do you see 2024? We were all saying that it appears to be a done deal, that it appears that there is actually going to be no contest to the BJP and the Narendra Modi combined. Few months down the line, it actually started changing from March onwards. That is what if we actually plot a timeline. Do you also share the sentiment that it appears that the government is not the BJP is not very confident as it appeared to be in the early part of this year? The steepest cut in the price of LPG cylinders is possibly indicative of the severity of the challenge which the BJP senses that it might be facing in the next parliamentary elections. Do you also see it this way?
Well, it sounds a little bit like, when the exams are approaching and you haven't done any preparation, right, and you panic and you think about what are the best ways, can you write the answers on your palm, or are there ways in which you can subvert the exam?
Carry a slip inside the examination room or actually find somebody who can leak a question paper. Correct,
exactly. So there's that sense of panic as the exam approaches and you haven't done your work. That's the sense. It's also, I think, something that many of us have been saying this, that hubris is a very strange thing. It builds up and then it gets to a point where it swallows itself. So you fail to read the mood of what is going on, and therefore take what measures you can. Now, yesterday, I know Mamata Banerjee tweeted, I think, that, it took only 2 meetings of the opposition alliance to meet and the LPG prices come down. It's true, and that's the way the opposition is reading it. That's their privilege. But, again, if I can make another point related to that it's quite interesting that reducing the price of gas cylinders immediately is seen to be an appeasement of women. Right. Like, as women are the only ones who cook, pay, or eat food cooked on gas stoves. The whole country does, right? But somehow this is meant
Cooking is supposed to be a woman's job. That's what patriarchy teaches. Yes, and that's what the Prime Minister also preaches.
Yes, but, and I can see, but this is where in 2019, giving women gas cylinders so that they can have a cleaner cooking environment is absolutely a pro-women measure. And there's no question about that. Reducing the price of a gas cylinder is a household budget issue, right? Number one. But it also raises this, how we read women voters in India, and talking of one of the big changes between 2014 and 2024 in the last few state elections and the 2019 Lok Sabha elections, the number of women voters in India has outstripped men. Now, so more Indian women are voting in elections than Indian men, and all political parties have, starting with Nitish Kumar in Bihar many, many moons ago, Mamata Banerjee in West Bengal, Karnataka, the free bus passes for women. There have been women-centric policies put forward to make ordinary women's lives better. And they all have a slightly different take on what they think is going to empower women, but that's a point of detail. What I want to add to this issue of more women voting than men is it's very interesting to me as an anthropologist. Why is this the case? What can we say? We haven't done any research on this. We don't know whether rural women, for instance, are voting in greater numbers for the same reasons that urban women are. Different parts of India. Why are women? So we need to study this in much greater detail. But I have three possible explanations. One is that in rural India, it's true that the state and government and elected representatives are much closer. It's a thicker state. The chances of a rural woman knowing the name of a panchayat president is very high. In urban India, knowing the name of your councillor, or even though there is a reservation for women, it's extremely unlikely. So the first thing is the state is thicker, as political scientists call it, in rural India. Secondly, there is reservation for women. Right? The 73rd, 74th Amendment, a third of the seats are for women, whereas in Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabhas, you see, the representation of women in parliaments, in Vidhan Sabhas, is less than 10%. I mean, it's
right.
The lack of attention is really across parties. Yeah. Yes, if you take an average. But these are, when women's turnouts have been rising is also the period in which two things have happened. One is that women's participation in the labor force has been dropping. Right? India, the figures are really stark. India's women are being pushed out. This is not, they're choosing to opt out, they're being pushed out because of low employment, falling employment figures. When there are opportunities, men grab them, women are kept out. So women are not participating in the labor force. And exactly the same decade that they've been pushed out of participating in the labor force, they are opting to make their voices heard through voting. So there's an interesting correlation which we need to test further.
Can I just interrupt and ask you a very short aside? Do women, your data, whatever is your field study experiences, do women decide on their own, or are they being guided by the men in their families?
It depends very much on which part of India you're talking about. There are some parts of India where women will say that they do as their father-in-law tells them to, or their husbands tell them to.
Right.
In large parts of India, women are wise enough to always say that when there are other people listening, right? I've had equal numbers of women, the same women in some cases, tell me afterwards that one of the things they really treasure about the experience of going to vote in a polling booth is precisely that it is the one moment in their entire lives when nobody can tell them what to do.
Yeah, it's the anonymity. It's the screen which covers the EVM machine.
It covers the EVM machine and it shuts out patriarchy just for that moment. And therefore they know they're playing, women have to survive in patriarchal structures and they know what to say in front of audiences and so on. So I think a lot of women are making up their minds, but it's impossible to know for sure, but there is no reason to suppose it. And the reason, again, to support that claim, I would say is the third reason that I was going to share with you, is that women's self-help groups in the last 20 years have been proliferating, and self-help groups which we haven't again understood enough is that whether or not they cause economic growth, are they good for the economy, the jury is out on that, right? Economists and development wallahs will argue over that. What is without doubt now from research and evidence is that it causes civic growth. So participation in self-help groups.
What is civic growth?
So civic growth is a term that I've coined to mirror what to mirror economic growth, right? So we all talk about economic growth as an indicator of how well the economy is doing. You measure it through GDP, you measure it, there are measures. Now, in the case, but we don't have any such term to capture the maturing of democratic and political understanding and what Amartya Sen calls political capacity. To be able to think and act as citizens would, to learn to weigh evidence, to learn to deliberate with others, to learn to negotiate, to learn to come to consensus, learn to keep your eye on the common good of a larger goal that your individual effort is very important a part of. All of these ideas, that it's a cluster of ideas that creates political maturity. And I think the term civic growth captures that. There has been civic growth in women through these different measures, right? And I think the participation in these self-help groups has been, and a recent paper of mine actually traces this quite closely. And because I can do this with very long-term data in a particular village, I also show that not only does it empower women, but it actually had, in this case, a direct impact on the electoral outcome. So there is a causal relation as much as a correlation. So I think, the LPG cylinder just triggered that whole chain of thought about women and women voters, which is actually one of the big changes. It's like the big changes between 2014 and 2024. What are the big things that have happened? Yes, there is, there's Article 370, there is the temple, there is Manipur that has happened, and there is COVID,
just joblessness.
And the absolute steep rise in unemployment, absolutely. The mismanagement of COVID, life is so cheap. The number of people who were literally thrown out on the streets without a safety net. And then there was the farmers' movement, right? Which was possibly the
completely unexpected, both the farmers' movement as well as the movement against the Citizens' Amendment Bill.
Yes.
You're seeing, these two movements took place in an India where actually the tightening of the state apparatus and curbing down of dissent was beginning to rise right after the 2019 parliamentary election, which gave a sense to the BJP that it had everything that it wanted, so it could do what it really wished to do in terms of curbing democratic rights.
Yeah.
So, there's something which I must ask you. I do not know. I always say that there is a conspiracy which time has against people who talk intelligently and about very important issues. So we are now beginning to race against the clock, whereas it doesn't happen with governments, for instance. They seem to be having all the time to do what they wish to do. One of the biggest developments which has happened in almost 1 year is the slow and steady transformation in the public image. I'm talking about the public image only. We do not know whether this is going to lead to anything else or not, of Rahul Gandhi. We got tired of listening to the word pappu, which means basically somebody who is not very smart. It's not been used ever since last September when he embarked on the Bharat Jodo Yatra. Though an academic based in the UK, you did come down to India and walked with the Yatra for some days to be able to see that what was it that was really clicking. Can you share your assessment of what has happened? How has Rahul Gandhi's image changed? And whether this is actually going to lead to any electoral benefit or not for the opposition.
Okay, let me just briefly talk about the Yatra, because for your audience, as a first-hand account, when I think of what the Yatra, why it was important to be there, the Congress media team was doing a very good job of, the social media feed was very populated with images and what was going on. But as an anthropologist, we do field work. I really wanted to be there to sense how much of this was palpable.
Yes.
And what was really evident was the feeling of, the best way to describe it is a sort of collective effervescence. This is a term by the sociologist Durkheim, which was
Collective?
effervescence.
Okay.
So, so it's effervescent because people are literally, there is something that a collectivity creates that a single individual cannot create. It's the atmosphere at a cricket match. It is the atmosphere at a kirtan. It is the atmosphere of Eid prayers.
We have seen that in many political agitations in India also.
That's right.
Most importantly, whether we like it or not, in the Ayodhya agitation, we actually saw, not on one occasion, but on several occasions leading up to the demolition of the Babri Masjid in December 1992.
So I'm so glad you said that, because it draws attention to the fact that you can create emotions of different kinds, right? You can create, and I think right-wing ideology generally, majoritarian ideology of the kind that the Rath Yatra was about, is actually a very efficient way to create emotions of negativity. Right? They are about
it feeds on insecurity which
Absolutely.
is there inherent in everyone.
So you have men feeling emasculated and insecure. They lash out. They're full of hate. You only have to see Anand Patwardhan's films to listen to those young men on their way to Ayodhya, on the way to destroy Babri Masjid. So the right wing is very good at whipping up emotions. On the other side, people who don't want a majoritarian agenda, who want democratic politics, who want a liberal, progressive way of doing politics, are relatively less good at creating emotion. What is the kind of thing that you feel you can die for, that you will give up your time for and money for to go and fight? And I also came to be part of the farmers' agitation right at the very end, when unexpectedly there were, so I'd seen the farmers' sites of protest at Singhu border, and then at Bharat Jodo Yatra. There is electricity in the air, but it is a set of positive emotions. And like I said, on our side, on this side, and I count very much, unambiguously myself as somebody who's pro-democracy and pro-diverse and multi-faith India. That side, to create a positive set of emotions, is actually quite a difficult thing. It doesn't happen often enough. We are very intellectual, we have rational arguments, but can you be moved to tears? Can you be moved to patriotism, to fight for something? And in the Bharat Jodo Yatra, that was the sense, as an Indian citizen, which I am, that India is a diverse country. It is, it's got all the faiths and it's got all kinds of people. But to actually see it together in a ragtag bunch of people who happen to have come together also made this point that you are part of something simply because you want to be a part of it. You don't have any other agenda. So there were lawyers, there were civil society actors, there were journalists, there were filmmakers. Anand Patwardhan was there. Dilip D'Souza, the journalist, was there. He's writing a book about Bharat. He's just finished writing it. In fact, it's great. None of us knew each other from before, but we all, and there were lots of people whose names I didn't know, whose work I didn't know, but I met them and we walked together and had our meals together and slept at night in the same tent, in the same shamiana. And you are there with a sense of purpose that you want to be there. And it was very good to have a positive, we weren't protesting about anything. It was about, Jodo is a very powerful word. In a country that is feeling fractured and polarized, if you say we want to
unite, is actually a very big call. So giving a call to people to unite is actually a very big call.
Yeah. So it is, and it's a positive set of emotions. To say this is about taking into the fold of joining with others first. You've got to join with the person standing next to you before you can join the country. And that's precisely what was happening. You were surrounded by strangers in this
you didn't get the feeling that it was essentially a middle class, outpouring of middle class angst, middle class professional angst.
Not at all.
What we call the arm Indian, the common people of India.
From what I saw, I think the anti-CA NRC protests may have been more of that. Bharat Jodo Yatra wasn't, the number of people who spoke English as their first language was minuscule. It was really tiny. There were a lot of people, a lot of work had gone into bringing together civil society organizations from local areas where the Yatra was passing through. Yogendra Yadav and others were doing this work. And the Congress workers were local Congress workers. So the bit I walked through was in Rajasthan. So yes, the chief minister and the deputy chief minister were very much around, but actually it was, regular Congress workers. But even more importantly, for the little bit of time that I walked alongside Rahul Gandhi, the roads were lined, every building, every terrace was lined with complete Aam Aadmi and Aurat, lots of just ordinary people who were either curious or excited. It made for a break from routine, but they were all there because they wanted to see it. And as a member of the Yatra, as a complete nobody in that Yatra, I felt, as did indeed everybody around me, that somehow there should be some engagement, some waving, some shouting of slogans with the people who had gathered to support the Yatra and at least come and wave it through. Very much like if there's a marathon passing through your neighborhood, you might go and cheer the runners on. It was very much in that mood, but they were ordinary people. And the idea that this was about bringing Indians together, about bringing India together was disseminated. People saw that.
I think one of the reasons as to why, or rather, let me ask, do you think that this was one of the reasons as to why it got the kind of resonance was because that they were trying to unite people purely because they were Indians? They were not trying to be one type of Indians. It was not like a category of Indians, but any Indian, is welcome here. That is what possible.
And I think, therefore, Rahul Gandhi's decision from time to time to invite just random people from the crowd and say, why don't you come in and walk with me for a while, was very powerful because there were little children. I mean, when are children taken seriously in political life in India? They're never taken
lifelong memories of people.
That's right. And there was when I was walking, one of the people who came in and was walking with Rahul Gandhi was a little girl, and she was clutching a piece of paper. And he said, "Isme kya hai? Ye paper kya hai?" She said, "Samvidhan hai." And she had the preamble on it. And he said, "Padha hai?" She said, "Haan, maine padha hai." So he said, "Pad ke batao." So now, so she started reciting the preamble. So then they had a discussion about words like democratic, secular, republic. What did these mean? What did this? It was not a very long conversation. But the child had made an effort, it was recognized, and it was taken seriously, and everybody around them noticed this, as did Rahul Gandhi. And I think this kind of thing, I don't know what it does for his image. I think our elite Indians who thought he was a Pappu and now think, oh, he's not. Well, it's neither here nor there. There's plenty of counter evidence for them. But I think this performance of participation and decency, which you need in public life. This is a democratic polity, right? So if your leaders are going to be approachable, who are interested in you, who can be genuinely concerned. He said this in many press interviews now, that he stopped wearing a sweater when a bunch of farmers came to meet him and they were shivering in the cold because they walked through the winter months a lot of the time, that he just felt he couldn't. Now, you may say this is performance, this is just for show, but you can't put on a show for 5 months. No, you somewhere, if you put a t-shirt, it's cold. So I think somewhere I've always said that in India, partly because of the state of our education or illiteracy, and indeed the numbers that we deal with in Indian democratic politics, that the visual impact of what you do, what you wear, how you conduct yourself actually is very powerful, because people watch this stuff. Right? They look at it and say,
Right.
is this person, when you're comparing leaders, I used to see this in Bengal all the time. The communist government was led by, all through the left frontiers, 34 years of it, and I was there for many of them. The left front government was, at least the chief minister when Jyoti Basu, was patrician. He had absolutely immaculate clothes and
the Bengali Bhadralok, as they say.
Yes, and this idea that and our
Mamata Banerjee, the challenger, was completely different. She was somebody who
he
actually
was somebody anybody could
was
identify.
just like anybody who could be found walking around Kali Ghat. So that
Exactly. So I think these things. So if so, the Bharat Jodo Yatra, I think, for what it's done for Rahul Gandhi's own image and for a sense of recovering fortunes, is, a lot of people can talk about that. What I find very persuasive is that it creates for the liberal space a set of emotions. And it's interesting, that we don't, there are two recent things I just read, one in last week's Economist and one in a column in the Financial Times yesterday. Let me tell you about them because they are relevant to what we're talking about. This study in The Economist that they report on by 4 academics is looking at US data on trying to establish whether moral values of voters had any impact on whether they voted Democrat or Republican. Right? Okay. And the way they try and get this is to look at public data on charitable giving. Right. And they look at a bunch of voters and say, what are the causes they're giving to? And can we then map their choices on their voters' choices? And it's very interesting that voters who gave to universal causes, to people who they did not know, to what they call universalistic.
They turned out to vote for the Democrats?
That they vote, yes, exactly. And so if you had very local parochial concerns, you tended to. Now, I'm not saying that this would map
this would
exactly down to India.
You cannot mirror it in India completely, but yes, I know what.
Yeah. So, what are moral values be for, I would want to, for instance, how you treat your domestic staff. What are your values on reservations? What do you think about Dalits? What is the role of patriarchy in how you raise the women in your family? These may be the moral values that would map onto a certain kind of political inclination or not. That is one. The second thing, which is a broader, I've been reading this philosopher Martha Nussbaum a lot recently, and she has this terrific book called Political Emotions, making precisely this point that, why don't we, she says, on our side, the liberal side, have enough emotions? And emotions need to be carefully manufactured and cultivated. They don't just come out of nowhere, which is why I think one needs to learn from the other side on how to manufacture. And the Rath Yatra, like you said, was a brilliant example of manufacturing of state. But this there's a new game, and Ivan Krastev has a column in yesterday's Financial Times, and people can look it up. It's a new board game, which is called Secret Hitler. And it is basically a game in which the fate of democracy depends on the talent of liberal elites to trust friends and uncover conspiracies. Right? So there's a trap. But basically, the trap is that the people on Hitler's side, the fascists, are actually very good at trusting each other. On the other side, people there is much more hair splitting. There is, there's a cooperation dilemma. You are paralyzed by suspicion and mistrust.
I would definitely, look up this particular column and find more about the game and talk about it.
Yeah.
I unfortunately am absolutely out of time, so I definitely would like to, conclude our conversation on the note that what came out with the conversation with you is that Suddenly, the Electoral Board of India has become much more lively than what appeared a few months back. To a great extent, this has been because of the failures of the government. Also, to a great extent, it has also been because of the opposition parties feeling the need to be able to try to work with each other. And of course, behind all this thing has been the rediscovery of himself, that is of Rahul Gandhi. A lot of people say that he's possibly found himself through the Bharat Jodo Yatra. Thank you very much, Dr. Mukulika Banerjee, for being here. We really are going to have a very lively period between now and next May, by when the next government would be in place. We hope that it will be a government which actually enables democracy to become stronger. Thank you very much once again.
Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more news and updates.